everyone, and you're all very welcome to the new series of our Client Experience webinar program. Whether it's the very first time you're joining us or you've been with us right from the very start, you're joining over 2,000 general counsel and in-house legal team members around the world who've registered for our current series. Shaped by the input of this community, our Client Experience webinar program is really focused on delivering practical insights on some of the most topical issues facing you and your in-house legal team. These sessions are all about you. We're really keen that you get the most value out of each session when it comes to practical takeaways. So I'd really encourage you to make the most of the chat and the messaging functions as we work through today's discussion. Today's session is the first of 7 sessions in our current series that will happen between now and March of 2025. So without further ado, I'm very excited to hand you over to my colleague Pamela Shin, who will lead our session today and introduce you to the panel. I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you so much, Niamh, and hello everyone. I'm Pamela Shin, and I'm a partner in the Dentons Toronto Tax Group, and I lead the firm's charity and nonprofit practice. I've had the pleasure of serving as in-house counsel and the privilege of advising boards. I'm excited to introduce to you a number of Dentons colleagues, all former general counsel and board members who bring very rich experiences to today's important discussion. So I'll start off by having Stephanie first introduce herself.
Thank you, Pamela. I'm Stephanie Aberton. I am counsel in Dentons US, splitting my time between Washington, D.C. and New York. Prior to joining Dentons a little bit over a year ago, I had a 25-year in-house career, including most recently as general counsel, corporate secretary, board advisor, and a few other hats at a startup that I had the interesting experience of starting prior to launch and running the company all the way through the sale process. And prior to that, I was at a number of large media companies, including in one particular instance relevant to today, being a member of the legal department of the parent company and simultaneously serving as the general counsel of various subsidiaries and advising their boards, which wasn't always a consistent experience. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Stephanie. Now I'll turn to Michelle to outline her experience, please.
Hi, Pamela. It's wonderful to join you and Stephanie and Kate today with our clients online. I'm a partner in corporate in Sydney, Australia. And in my 28-year career, I have formerly been a general counsel of a boutique investment bank in Australia and also a senior corporate counsel of an ASX 100 financial institution. I've also been a director on the board of the Australian Investment Council, our peak body for the private capital sector in Australia, and also on a not-for-profit organisation. And I regularly advise boards on all manner of legal issues in my daily job. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And we're also delighted to be joined today by Kate Broer, who many of you know well from our client experience and WOW programs. Kate will input from an inclusion and diversity perspective. Kate, please introduce yourself as well.
Thanks very much, Pam, and it's great to be here with all of you again, to the extent I've been on a CX program with you before. I'm Kate Broer. I'm our Global Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity Officer here at Dentons. I happen to sit in Toronto, but I work with Dentons colleagues all over the world, and I'm delighted to have worked with clients and general counsel all over the world on inclusion, diversity, and equity matters. I also sit with our global board here at Dentons and advise our board at the firm on inclusion, diversity, and equity related matters. So delighted to join, and back to you, Pam.
Thank you, Kate, and I'm sure all of you are excited to hear from our distinguished panelists today. And so we'll go through a series of 3 core areas as we've structured our discussion. The first being around the role of the general counsel, and then navigating change in that position, and lastly, balancing conflicting stakeholder priorities. At the end, we'll have a question and answer period. We'll also have some polls throughout our discussion to get your feedback about what's important to you and things at the top of your mind. So without further ado, we'll start with our first question, which I'll direct to Michelle. What is the role of general counsel? It's a big question, and there's so many different ways to answer the question, but we'd love to hear from you, your thoughts on this, please.
Thanks, Pamela. Look, the word counsel is obviously key to the role, and the role is to be a trusted advisor, providing always very robust and considered counsel to the board and the company. And I'll just touch firstly on 3 areas which can cause, that challenge of conflict and how you navigate that role. Just talk about expectations, perceptions, and value. So clearly the expectations of the general counsel is to be the trusted advisor, and that's to know the law and how it should be applied to commercial decisions in every context. And that's a big and broad expectation. And it's important to understand that this is big and broad and how to meet that effectively. When it comes to perceptions, it's important to understand that you will have cheerleaders, but you will also have naysayers. And the variances of views are wide across the organisation and also from your external stakeholders. So how you fit within that perception and those variances, and also how you meet your expectation, requires a lot of consistency and trust. And thirdly, talking about values. So the legal function is generally seen as a cost centre. So how do you show value for money? I mean, what you bring and what your team brings to the organisation, or even further, how do you demonstrate how you're part of the value equation is really important. And as I said, these are all challenging and sometimes contradictory, mainly because different executives and board members will have different views on all of these issues and how they should be addressed. So, for example, if you consider the big and broad expectation of a general counsel to be able to provide trusted advice and counsel on all issues facing the company, you can only do this if you have the right-sized and effectively trained team, and you also have external counsel who help fill those gaps. But this requirement for an effective team and external counsel and their related costs can be contrary to some company executive views as to how legal costs should be managed and should be controlled. So it's important to understand your role as GC is always under controversial review and judgment and criticism. And, your role is going to have to meet and respond to those reviews and those judgments and those criticisms. It's a tough gig. So how do you embed yourself with the board, the executive team and the company as an effective operator navigating these challenges? A big question. I think you just have to start by being a trusted advisor. So let's unpack this. Be consistent. So you would provide the same advice to the business as you would the board, as you would to the court. And I think that's an important message. You also need to be a very good manager because you are managing a team and you're managing the legal function and how it effectively can provide that trusted advisory service to the company and the board. Including as to how you can demonstrate value. And you really do need to know your business, your executives, and how your board functions. And your relationships are absolutely key. But your relationships are formed solely for the purpose of building arm's length trust in your advisory capacity, and not for other objectives. So this is a really important fundamental principle. It means you sometimes do have to give advice that someone doesn't want to hear. And so how you build that trust is absolutely essential to how you fulfill your role. You need to use your position and choose your words carefully in how you give advice. And I think it's always important to start a difficult conversation with a statement of intention and principles, which does help set an open and constructive framework for having those difficult conversations. And all those general counsel out there will know that your day is often filled with many difficult conversations. But you do build relationships of trust by being consistent to your intentions and your principles. And finally, you do need to know your legal and regulatory scope. The legislative and regulatory framework you operate in and can advise on should present no surprises to you. So you need to have a solid understanding of the legal and regulatory landscape and an effective team to manage that scope, because that's generally pretty broad. And including in your team, you need to have effective external counsel who can support you. So you need to know how to use your team and to provide this trusted counsel support to the company and the board consistently and reliably. And so there's just no substitute for spending time across the business, getting to know the business activities, the management team, the dynamics and the pressures, understanding, breathing and living the business day in and day out provides the general counsel with the inside information to provide optimal advice, and also to have a strong understanding of the key risks within the business. And to be able to provide commercially pragmatic advice, which is also independent. I would sum up there, but I think, Pamela, I'm going to pass on to the next question, and I think we can talk about the sort of key attributes towards the end of the program today.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Michelle. Lots of insights there. And I almost think that we should retitle this role as the superhero of any organization, wearing so many different hats. And on that, Stephanie, how do you balance your responsibilities as a lawyer with your responsibilities as an executive?
Well, and this is something that I have dealt with in part because I've been fortunate enough in my career to work at companies that do view lawyers as partners in every way. And so as the general counsel, you are also a key senior executive in the company. And I think, in my experience, where that really comes into play is, in order to be the best general counsel you can be, you have to know the business, and you have to know the business as well as everybody else in the business does. Because as Michelle was saying, your job in one sense is to be a senior executive in the company, pushing forward with all of the commercial objectives and goals of the company. On the other hand, your job also is somewhat uniquely in the boardroom and in the C-suite to also be the person that knows when to say, okay, we need to pause here for this reason or that reason, or simply because somebody has just overlooked a key regulatory or legal issue. And that can be tough to balance when the business is a ship that is just moving forward at lightning speed. And so I think that if you follow the advice that Michelle gave, and you spend time building relationships as an executive, and show that you know the business, and you think of your role as the general counsel through the lens of, my client is actually not this person or that person or this board member or the CEO, but my client is actually the corporation, and I'm just bringing a different perspective to the table and some unique responsibilities and obligations to help get the company where it needs to be, that you will earn the trust of everybody you're working with. And once in a while, you will have to, and I have used this phrase more than once, you will have to say, okay, I'm not really giving you legal advice here, but as someone who is an executive running a department of X number of people in this business, I also have a perspective that I want to share. And sometimes you have to say, I get everything you all are doing and trying to accomplish, but if you don't mind, I have to put my lawyer hat on here for a minute. And trying to balance those roles, the two key things in my experience are, one, the relationships with the people at every level, and in particular, the board members and the executives, who sometimes don't all agree, but all need to trust you. And second, your knowledge of the business. If you're giving practical commercial advice, as Michelle said, then you will have a much easier time balancing your roles as an executive and a GC, because they will actually mostly be in lockstep with each other. And sometimes it will be your job to message that perhaps what is best for a particular legal situation isn't necessarily winning, because winning might not be best for the company overall. and bring people on board with that. And it's not always easy to do, but sometimes that's where you have to deliver the message that not everybody wants to hear all the time.
Yeah, that's great advice, and certainly bracing yourselves for, those discussions where, yeah, you do need to have tough conversations and deliver some tough news, but having those trusted relationships along the way will certainly help with the impact. And if I could add to this discussion around, building on those relationships, serving in that kind of multifaceted role as general counsel to the board, the question around how can that role be more impactful, I think back to this point around solving business problems. We're, obviously being asked to provide legal advice, which is the baseline of any in-house counsel role. But it's going above and beyond that and really thinking, what is the number one risk of any organization? And I had a board chair once say to me, it's not achieving your mission. It's not actually, accomplishing the goals that you have set out. And that's how the board often thinks about risk. And so keeping that in mind, moving forward and not just solving, what are some of the legal challenges here, but helping to get to that end goal of helping the board achieve its mission as well. And then looking at it from a perspective of board governance and performance. It's not just about providing that advice again. It's also about helping the board with its governance and making sure that, there are performance metrics in place that we all hold ourselves accountable to, and bringing that to the discussion is certainly a way that I have seen elevate the role of general counsel, and for the board also to see that role as a partner as opposed to, a naysayer type of an approach. And on that, I wanted to bring in another perspective here on how that role of the general counsel can be expanded beyond just, that legal technical element, and what are some of the other considerations that are brought into the picture in that office. And so, Kate, if you could comment on where does inclusion, diversity, and equity fit into that role?
Thanks very much, Pam, and thanks all for the great comments. This is it's a great discussion when we talk about where does inclusion, diversity, and equity fit in, particularly with general counsels. And I don't know, I think our group here today is able to type into the chat, but I'm actually quite curious as to how many have an inclusion, diversity, and equity element to their remit. It's very common, obviously within somebody's department as a general counsel, but very frequently we will see general counsel's offices also being asked to take on an enterprise role when it comes to inclusion, diversity, and equity. So this really can trench on the general counsel's office often. But when we're thinking about it from a board perspective, there are some fundamental points that I start with. The first is, obviously, you're going to be worried about legal and regulatory obligations that your organization might have around board diversity requirements or similar. So you're going to be worrying about that. But if we go back to something that Pam was just talking about, which is really setting performance benchmarks and having a very well and high-performing board, which I think is the objective of any organization, and obviously a general counsel who's sitting at that table can contribute to that. If you're trying to feed that high-performing culture, that high-performing board, inclusion and diversity become really critical, because it has been shown that a more inclusive board is a better performing board. It's a higher performing board. It's been shown that more diverse and inclusive boards, and I always underline inclusive, and we'll talk about, what I really mean. They've been shown to be particularly good at managing issues that fall within the traditional wheelhouse of the legal function. they've been shown to be better at managing risk. There's a more careful thought and analysis that goes on in boardrooms that are more diverse and inclusive. There's often more robust discussion around issues. And when you have varied backgrounds and perspectives in the room, you can see how you can get to that outcome. These boards, again, more inclusive and diverse boards, they've been shown to be more effective in governance and oversight matters. They can also help reduce things like groupthink risk, when you get people who all think the same way, getting on the same train on a decision. And there's no counter or opposing perspective or different perspective to perhaps act as a check on that decision-making process. So thinking about those things as part of what's happening in the boardroom can be really important. I certainly have some tips I can share with the group. Maybe we'll save those about how to make that happen. But I do think the General Counsel has a particular interest in generating that inclusive board discussion, precisely because of that overall responsibility to ensure that risk, organizational reputation, brand, and governance are being managed. So with that, I'll send it back to you, Pam.
Thanks so much, Kate. We're looking forward to even more of those nuggets later on in our discussion. Before we move on to our next topic, Niamh is going to lead us through our first poll question.
Thanks, Pamela. So, as you know, we're always really keen to put all of you at the heart of this discussion. So we are keen to get your view on this topic. So, the question we have for you is, what do you see as the most challenging aspect of engaging with the board when it comes to your role as General Counsel? So is it around, as we spoke about, anticipating often that evolving legal and regulatory landscape? It may be around legal compliance, while I think Stephanie touched on supporting those business priorities at the same time. It might be around governance best practice. Maybe it's that unbiased legal advice we talked about while managing internal politics and expectations. Maybe it's clarity around your role. Is it an advisor, as an executive, or as a team member you're inputting? Maybe it's the expectation that you're an expert on every legal matter. It might be managing crises, or it also might be around more the legal function and operating with limited resources and budget. Or maybe it's something else entirely. And if it is, drop us a note in the chat. We're keen to get your views and input on this. So I can see some responses coming in already. So we'd love to give it just a few more seconds to get as many views as possible on this one. So let's do a short countdown. We'll go 5, 4, I can see the voting shooting up, 3, 2, 1. And we always have the last minute votes coming in, so it's lovely to see so many people getting involved. We're just hitting the 50% mark now. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results with you all. Okay, Pamela, so back to you. The expectation that you're an expert on every legal matter at 27% is right up there at the top, which is quite an interesting one. So back to you on that one.
I'm fascinated by these results, and thank you so much for your engagement. 50% participation is always encouraging, and we're going to have a couple more of these poll questions later on. So we encourage you to continue to provide your feedback, and we'll certainly incorporate it as we continue our discussion. All right. So our next topic is around navigating change, the one constant in all of our lives, whether we're advising boards or just living day-to-day life. And this whole concept of navigating regulatory changes and landscape, I think that's very much in line with this next topic. So I'll go to our panelist Stephanie on this question. How do you balance your role as General Counsel an executive leader when it comes to leading or inputting to change projects. And this can really go in a number of directions here, but I wonder if you could comment on the regulatory changes and kind of navigating that piece a little bit as well, please. You are on mute.
I unmuted myself and then I didn't. Regulatory change is a particularly significant one for the general counsel, and this feeds into actually the poll results, where the moment there is even a whiff of a potential regulatory change, often everyone in the business immediately believes that the general counsel should know everything about whatever it is, even if this particular agency or body has never before regulated your industry in any way, shape, or form. And I think this is an area where it's really important to know what resources are available to you and to be able to efficiently take advantage of them. As I'm sure we all have at one point in our lives advised our more junior colleagues that one of the most important keys to success is knowing what you don't know and being able to efficiently and quickly find the resources to educate yourself. And to some extent, the general counsel's job is actually 24/7 triage, where you don't have to know every single thing, but you do have to know where to quickly and easily find the answers to every single thing, whether it is within your own organization, if you're fortunate enough to have the experts, or through a network of outside counsel. And that extends, I think, to everything that happens. And as you're balancing your role as an executive and your role as a general counsel and managing and leading through change, one of the most important things is actually, in my experience, being a steady hand, being the one person in the room whose job depends on giving rational, thoughtful, unbiased advice, while also navigating through the fact that you have potentially a room full of 6 different people or 12 different people, all of whom view themselves as your client and may not actually have the same perspective. And so being a steady hand and being able to put your hands on all of the resources you need to get all of the information you need in order to be able to support and answer whatever anybody needs from you would be the most crucial thing. And then as a subset of that, always remembering throughout the entire process that you're also a leader of a department or group of people who are just as affected by this change as everyone else in the company, and making sure that you once in a while flip that hat on and think about how all of this is affecting your department, because you will need everybody in the legal department and everybody who's part of the legal function to also be a steady hand trickling down everything that you are trying to communicate to the board and the C-suite.
That's great. I think you also touched on one of the other poll questions there around really that expectation that you're an expert on every legal matter, which of course the general counsel should know everything, right? But that piece around being able to get to the resources that you need to be able to answer the questions that come up, the concept of not feeling that you have to have all of the answers on hand, but that you have a number of resources that you can reach out to be able to get those answers when you need it, and that being that steady hand. I think that's the piece that we all aspire to as counsel, whether we're in-house or whether we're in private practice. And so that does lead us to our final topic, which I think is a really meaty topic that we can get into here, balancing the interests of stakeholders with different responsibilities and priorities. And I see that in our poll here, one of the other kind of areas that's most challenging for our viewers today is around really ensuring that you're providing unbiased legal advice while managing internal politics and expectations. I mean, that is certainly a challenge in so many different areas of practice, and certainly in that role as general counsel to the board. So I wonder if, Michelle, you can answer for us, what advice would you have for our audience today on handling conflict scenarios with other stakeholders at the board table?
It's a great question, Pamela, and listening to Stephanie speak about being a steady hand, I think if you can always have a framework of being the steady hand, that's going to help you handle any conflict. And look, handling conflict at the board table specifically is a really important skill as the general counsel. And that is, one of the expectations that the rest of the board and, the executives are expecting from you, that you are in that role of, being a mediator and being a trusted advisor. I would always recommend that before you go into a board meeting, you are as well advised and well informed, because you should be prepared and already know from the board papers what issues of conflict are likely to arise at the board meeting. And you should have a strategy for dealing with those issues before. And that may be that you are having some pre-discussions with either the executives or the board members on the relevant issues, because no one in a board meeting likes surprises or for information to come up that's very difficult and very challenging to respond to. So I think if you are aware that there's going to be some challenging discussions, particularly if someone is going to be questioned antagonistically and you're aware that there's some antagonism in the room on a commercial decision, particularly where the relevant legal position may not be entirely clear, just to be aware that that conflict is going to rise and be prepared for it. So if you have had relevant discussions beforehand with some of the key stakeholders, to understand their commercial objectives and the parameters around the decision-making framework, but also so you can also help them understand what is the legal position. And if the legal position is unclear, it might be an area of regulatory change or an area where there's not a determinative decision and you're having to make judgments of commercial risk within those legal frameworks. I think it's important that you've been able to express your legal advice and views with those people before the board meeting. So they're aware of what your views will be at the meeting, and that helps them prepare for the meeting as well. So being prepared, having those pre-discussions can actually soften the conflict as and when it arises at the board meeting. It assists the stakeholders involved in the conflict to have a better understanding of where your position is on those legal issues and risk. And obviously playing a straight bat, in your prior discussions is essential. As we did talk about before, your role is to build that arm's length trusted advisor relationship, rather than playing favorites or currying favors. And people do expect that from you as the general counsel. So as I said, if relevant stakeholders are aware of your view and the legal position that you're going to be putting forth at the board meeting, it will lead to a more balanced discussion on the relevant issues in the meeting. And it comes back to what I was talking about before. It's really key to have very strong relationships and that you can demonstrably show in a board meeting that you have those relationships across each of the C-suite with the CEO, the CRO, the CCO, COO, the CIO, etc. If you can demonstrate that you have an understanding of all of the views of each executive function and how they all interrelate and how they can conflict from time to time, because of each of these functions are driving their own purpose and objectives. But that interaction and understanding of the integration of conflict between risk, compliance, operations, legal, data, technology in the business delivery context, that's going to be really helpful to you to help manage these conflicts. And also to understand how conflicts can arise when you are reading the board papers yourself. But But look, there can be other conflicts between executives and non-executive or independent directors, and sometimes those are conflicts which may not be known before entering the board meeting. You may yourself be surprised at the views expressed by a non-executive director, for example, that you didn't see coming. And that comes back to, I think, what Stephanie was saying is you have to be the steady hand. If there is a surprise in the meeting, if there is conflict that's brought up that wasn't expected, you really do need to tread that tightrope between being the commercial pragmatic advisor on the commercial, objective side, but also being the independent, legally privileged advisor as well, and really understanding how to manage the risks when there are some really difficult legal questions. Knowing when to use, confidentiality, privilege, terms such as without prejudice, or even knowing when to pause the meeting and to say, okay, we need to have a break here. We'll all have a 5-minute break and we'll reset. And that might give the opportunity to have some out of board meeting discussions on a really, really difficult issue. So I think, be fair and honest in your assessments. If you need time to consider issues, use it, as I said, as a break, because that can sort of bring the heat a little bit out of the conflict situation. It allows people to have a good think about the issues and to come back and regroup. But, as the GC, you are the steady hand, and, your role is to provide independent advice in a very measured and a very calm way. Thanks, Pamela.
Thank you. Thank you. And I wonder if then, Stephanie, you can walk us through what advice you would have when a scenario escalates to a crisis. We heard a lot about the steady hand and kind of being that calm, measured person. Now, how does that look like when we get into the context of a crisis?
It is even more important and even more significant that in the midst of a crisis, the general counsel has to be a steady hand. If the GC is panicking, then everyone else around you is panicking. And I look at everything through the lens of what are the various different things and the various different lenses we should be thinking about it through, and what's the process. And in a crisis, the GC's process is not any different than it ordinarily is. It just all happens at twice the speed with twice the stress. And what that means is, first and foremost, you need to understand who all of your constituencies are. You will have in a crisis, you will have the board as a constituency. You will have your C-suite and fellow peer executives as a constituency. You will have other employees in the company as the constituency. You will have your team as a constituency. And in many cases, especially if you work in a high profile industry like I did, you will have an external facing constituency as well that is important. And you as the general counsel will need to try to give the best advice you can give to each one of those constituencies, keeping in mind the interests of all of the other ones, but not being their representative, and trying to help each individual constituency accomplish their goals in a way that minimizes the legal risk for the company of the crisis. And it's really easy to say that. Making that happen in the real world is sometimes a little bit more difficult. But the other thing is, you need to think through what are the resources available to you and how do you want to deploy them? When is the right time to call outside counsel if you're in a crisis? And how do you use them? What are you doing about your own team? How are you managing the different interests of the board members or of the executives? And most importantly, how are you as a lawyer going to contribute to helping those who are managing the crisis rather than interfering with their ability to manage the crisis by throwing up red flags and legal risks everywhere they turn? And so actually looking at it through the lens of being a truly steady hand, but a very practical advisor. It's almost impossible to get through a crisis, a true crisis, with zero risk. And so how do you work through with the board and with any other constituency what the risks are of each of the different paths so that they know what risks they're choosing to take and there are no surprises? It would be wonderful if there were no surprises before you walked into the room. Sometimes you can't accomplish that. But even more important is, as the general counsel in a crisis, it really becomes your role to see around the corners and take advantage of every resource you have available to identify everything that might happen, try to quantify the different risks of the different paths, and help the executives and the board find the right one to push forward on based on what's best for the company overall. Rather than simply saying that's a risk, this is a risk, that's a risk. And so ultimately thinking about how you can, as a general counsel, both navigate and lead through a crisis to get to an answer where no matter what happens, there are no surprises, even if it's not always a perfect outcome.
I love that. I think, you know, what I'm hearing over and over again too is this whole concept of communication and, you know, letting people know before a meeting, really no surprises. And it all goes back to how do you just build trust? I think if you just take this out of the context even of, you know, the role of a general counsel and just how do you build trusted relationships? And it's around making sure you don't blindside someone. You know, making sure people understand your intentions and know where you're coming from. And a lot of that is, you know, just life skills that we can bring into any context, whether that's in our role as general counsel, you know, in calmer times, in crises. And I do think it would be helpful for us as well to hear from Kate on talk to us about conflict from an ID and E perspective.
Thanks so much, Pam. Well, I don't know if this is surprising or people will be surprised, but conflict's actually a good thing from an inclusion, diversity, and equity perspective. But we should distinguish, for sure, between good conflict and bad conflict. Of course, we don't want conflict where people are dysfunctional or disrespectful or unable to have effective conversations. But from an inclusion, diversity, and equity perspective, conflict is good. From a board effectiveness perspective, when we think about inclusion and the role it has to play, conflict is good. So when I was mentioning earlier all the good things that come with more inclusive and diverse boards, for example, they better manage risk, they tend to have better governance outcomes, their governance oversight tends to be more robust. The organizations with more inclusive boards and diverse boards tend to have better brand and reputation, manage risk better, and so on. What's more interesting than all those data points is why does that happen, or why do we think that happens? This is a tricky area for sure. Data has to be qualitative in its nature, and obviously what happens in boardrooms tends to stay behind closed boardroom doors. But what we do know is that when there is an inclusive environment, and this is really about the boardroom culture, when there's inclusive environment and there are many perspectives in the room, and perspectives are informed by life experiences, and life experiences are informed by many things: geography, education, background, heritage, gender, and so on and so forth. But when you have those diverse perspectives and the opportunity for them to be shared freely, openly, and in an environment of trust, you can bring together that magic that comes from greater inclusion, diversity, and equity in the room. So we'll call that good conflict. You want the folks in the room challenging perspectives, asking questions, testing the waters, all the good things that that a general counsel is going to want to make sure is happening when you're testing a proposition, testing a commercial decision, and so on and so forth. So that's the universe of the good conflict that you're striving for. Now, what's tricky about it, or can be very tricky about it, is it doesn't feel as good to people as when everybody's agreeing. So I mentioned that, that idea about groupthink risk. And what groupthink risk is, you get people who come from the same background, they went to the same university, they've got the same educational path, they've worked in the same industry, whatever it might be. They don't have that breadth of perspective, but it's really comfortable to be in a room like that. Everybody speaks each other's language. It's easy. The thought patterns are very familiar, if not identical, but it can lead you down paths that feel good, but aren't actually generating the types of decisions or the robust discussions and analysis that happens with those more diverse groups, which can challenge each other's sense of the way things should be and take a little bit more time with that analysis that's so important in a lot of boardroom decisions. So again, we don't want to get this is that universe of good conflict. We don't want to get to dysfunction or bad behavior or bullying, but we do really want to have that robust conversation happening in the room. So something to be keeping in mind, and as a general counsel, if you have an opportunity to invite that type of discourse, I think it goes a very long way. It will go a very long way to a high-performing and effective, contributing to a high-performing and effective board.
So maybe you can provide us some tips, Kate, on how do you actually encourage more robust conversation? Because I think, back to this point around it's uncomfortable, and people do tend to like, kind of the status quo, and they don't like being pushed out of their comfort zones. And I mean, even for some general counsel, I think it can be very uncomfortable to have to play that role of being the one to ask the tough questions and to encourage that discussion. What are some of the practical tips that we can share with our audience today on encouraging those robust discussions?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Pam. It can be very, very tricky. You certainly don't want to put people on their back foot or make them feel attacked or embarrassed. If there is a tone that can be set, and this might be something you do together with your board chair, talk about how are the conversations, what's the orchestration of the conversations? So one of the things that we would encourage is actively seeking the input of all of the participants in the meeting. Oftentimes, again, to your point, people don't want to, I'm going to use an idiom, they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to upset anybody. They don't necessarily want to put forward an opposing view. But there are ways you can use the governance structure, again, with the help of the board chair, to proactively solicit people's viewpoints. In fact, you could go as far as saying, does anyone have an opposing view? Are there any elements of what we're discussing that perhaps are bothering people that we should maybe just talk through a little more so that we can get to a greater comfort level? So I think, again, creating that culture where there's an invitation to disagree, as opposed to just letting silence reign, which I think can often happen in a lot of rooms. It can take time to get there, but I think through consistent and intentional effort, where we're inviting those voices and specifically inviting contradictory views into the conversation, over time, you can certainly build up, hopefully, toward an environment where that's accepted and people are open to the idea that, yes, we don't all have to think alike, and yes, we might have some differing perspectives, and that's a good thing.
Thanks so much, Kate. That's super helpful. I like the concept of inviting disagreement, inviting differing ideas. Sometimes people feel, they need a bit of a prompt to go to that place. And I do see we have a question online here, which we'll save for the question and answer period we're getting really close to. Before we go there, I'm going to invite Niamh to share another poll question for us.
Excellent. Thank you, Pamela. So Michelle mentioned a straight bat earlier, which I thought was quite entertaining. So we have a very direct, straight bat question for everybody right now. So we would love to know, how confident do you feel in your ability to manage conflict at board level? Would you say you feel completely confident with this? Hopefully some of the nuggets our panel shared has helped with the answer to this question. Fairly confident, somewhat confident, maybe slightly confident, or really not at all confident when it comes to this area. So we have lots of people getting involved in this one. So it's lovely to see the numbers shooting up in terms of votes and interesting results as well. So we'll just give it 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So we'll end the poll and share the results now. So Pamela, on this one, we have 40% feeling fairly confident. An additional 36% feeling somewhat confident. So Kit, I don't think we're encouraging that good conflict yet, but hopefully some of our audience may be thinking differently about conflict after the discussion we've just had. So back to you, Pamela, on this one.
Thank you, Niamh. I was going to say, if there's anyone out there who's completely confident, please call me so I can pick your brain and get your advice on how to navigate conflict and conflicting priorities. So we're going to move forward now to our question and answer period. We do have a question here online, and the question relates to being new in your role. It's difficult to know a company well when you are newly appointed, so that you can advise the board at the level that has been discussed today. What are the top 2 or 3 things that you suggest you need to do as soon as you start a GC role in a new company that really make a difference? I would like to just offer one thing, and then I'll do a bit of a roundtable from our panelists here. I know that there's many different ways to start out your sort of first 90 days, as they say, right? One of the things that has helped me in any new role is the concept of a listening tour. I'm sure you've heard of this terminology before, but really it's, back to, I think Stephanie said, kind of mapping out constituents, doing that kind of lay of the land, understanding how an organization is structured and governed, mapping out your constituents and doing a bit of a listening tour around what are their key priorities, what are some of the pain points that they've experienced in maybe receiving legal service advice in their daily work, meeting their objectives and that kind of thing, and just getting to know people and letting them get to know you on a human level as well. Michelle, do you want to weigh in on this? And then Stephanie and Kate, please.
Yes, thanks, Pamela. I definitely agree with the listening tour, and I think in the first 90 days you want to get around and have as many coffees as you can. But importantly in those coffees, I think also stating what your intentions are as general counsel and the principles by which you wish to operate to set that framework is really important. I also think the second thing is go back and read the board papers for the last 2 or 3 years, which, swotting is always helpful. So you're well studied up as to what the issues are that the company is facing. And thirdly, I would say have a meeting with the chair, sit down with the chair, understand the board dynamics, and really get to understand the different personalities in the boardroom and how the chair sees that, because I think that's really important.
Thank you. Stephanie?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to have an echo a little bit, and I will preface this by saying that this is not just my advice for the first 90 days, but this is the ongoing, consistent thing that I believe that every general counsel should do and should keep doing throughout their entire tenure in order to be able to add the most value and be the most successful. And that is to build relationships and know the business. And, Michelle mentioned coffees. I come from the entertainment industry, so I would describe it as having lunch with every board member and every key executive in the company. And don't just build those relationships upward or horizontally, but also get to know the people who are going to tell you the truth in the organization. And do that as quickly as possible, because you want to have the framework for those relationships and you want to have a demonstrated knowledge of the business before people have to rely on you in a crisis and before you have to be the one who said no. So, and really to cap off the first 90 days, I'm a lawyer, so I believe in reading and sucking up information. Whatever the trades are that your clients are reading every day, whatever whoever is reporting or doing a podcast or whatnot on your business, immediately sign up and start sucking all of that information up, because that's what everybody around you is listening to and relying on, and you don't want to be behind them in the knowledge race.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. Kate, anything to add from your perspective?
Well, as I've never been a GC, what I'll add is if you really are getting stuck, you should call Pamela, Michelle, or Stephanie. They can help you out. But lean on your advisors when you need to. Back to you, Pam.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I see we have one more question, and we are running up against time. So what we're going to do is come back to the question that Susan has posted offline. So we thank you for your question. And Niamh, do we have time for one more poll?
I think we may go to close. We're approaching the top of the hour. We would love to stay chatting for much longer on this topic, and indeed we could, but we will move to just close the session now. So I am just going to quickly share two things with everyone today. We would love to hear your feedback on today's session. Please just drop your comments, your feedback into the chat, or you can also drop us an email at cxprogram@dentons.com. We have lots of great sessions on the agenda over the coming months, so it's not too late to share these sessions with your teams around the world and to get involved in the conversation across lots of different themes and topics over the coming months. I also am super keen to share a really fantastic tool with everyone. So earlier this year, we reached out to all of our client experience community. And one of the big things that you asked for and felt would provide a really super level of value is to have access to some of these types of insights when you want it, whenever you want it, where you want it. Centrex is our new online offering that provides that. So lots of extra content, insights, toolkits, practical checklists now available to you 24/7. So we just encourage you to have a look and let us know what you think of that also. I want to say a huge thanks to all of you for joining us today, and I want to say a special thank you to our panel. They have battled flights, time zones, across planning sessions to put together what I hope you felt was a session that provided some practical insights and value to you in the context of your role. So thank you, Pamela, for hosting, Michelle, Stephanie, and of course, Kate, a huge friend of our programme at this point. Thank you all for joining us. That concludes our session today, and we look forward to seeing you over the coming months.